say thank you for being here. This is the Transforming the Future webinar series. It picks up a bit from the book, Transforming the Future, which I think most of you are familiar with, published by Routledge and UNESCO back in 2018, coming out in three new languages perhaps this year, Spanish, Farsi, and Chinese, already in Arabic, French, available for free, PDF download. But the idea is to continue to explore the topics and many issues that remain to be deepened and debated that come out of that work and the work on anticipatory systems and processes. And we're really, I'm very grateful, and it's a huge privilege, of course, to be able to invite people like Bruce Tonn, who has been a colleague and friend, worked together on the journal Futures, the editorial board, and Association of Professional Futurists, and conferences around the world. The same for Roumiana, who has been a colleague and a companion on the intellectual road for many years now, since we met at IPTS, the Institute for Prospective Technological Studies, where many of you, I think, also visited back in the day. Lastly, I want to really thank Irianna for being with us. She's a colleague I had since I arrived at UNESCO, and is somebody who has also followed the various meandering and kind of different pathways of futures thinking and futures literacy over the last decade. This is meant to be a chance to share and exchange. We'll turn the floor over to Bruce. There'll be some time for the discussants to give their views, and then there'll be a Q&A period. I also want to thank Clara, who's been the organizer of the Transforming the Future webinar series these days, and her efforts to put it all together and make sure that it's well organized. Thank you, Clara. So with no further ado, and just to mention, Clara will put links to the bios, the LinkedIn bios of Bruce, Roumiana, and Irianna in the chat. So if you want to go check that out, you'll get more details about their lives. Ready to roll?
Okay, ready. Thank
Great
you, Riel.
stuff. Over to you, Bruce.
Okay, thank you so much for allowing me to share some ideas with you all today. My name is Bruce Tonn. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee, in the United States. And you can see it's pretty sunny where I am this morning. So the title of my talk is Big Picture Framework for Addressing Obligations to Future Generations and Risks of Human Extinction. The presentation has four parts to it. First part, I'll kind of present what I think of big picture futures. The second part is why we should care about future generations and what our obligations to future generations could be. The third part is presents various institutional proposals to help us meet our obligations. And the fourth part addresses the need, the need and the value of fostering change and the importance of futures literacy in this whole program. So big picture futures. Very long time frame. I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to start 1 billion years from now, celebrating the end of life on Earth. Scientists anticipate that as the sun dies and expands, it'll engulf the Earth and the Earth will become uninhabitable about 1 billion years from now. And wouldn't it be nice if we were able to maintain life on Earth for that until that period of time ends and when the Earth becomes uninhabitable? So if you work back in time, one can imagine anticipate that plate tectonics will continue to take place and a new supercontinent may coalesce. Before that, we could be colonizing galaxies, and before that, distant solar systems. But to do those things, make those achievements, it will take a very, very long period of time, not tens of years or hundreds of years, or maybe even thousands of years, or maybe tens of thousands of years. So our planning period to sustain human life on Earth to achieve these goals is very long. Around 10,000 years from now, the nuclear waste that we're now storing in various places on Earth will become inert and will not pose risk to humans and other species. I believe around 3,000 years from now, for us to get to that longer journey through time and space, we'll have to transverse a social, economic, and political singularity to where our cultures and economics and politics and just things, how we approach things will be really quite different than they are today. And it's a little hard to imagine what those things could be. So the notion of the singularity comes into play. To get to that singularity of change, we need to resolve anthropogenic risks to our own existence. And I think climate change is the top of that list, but we've seen pandemics and other things to worry about. And even before that, I'm worried about resolving existential risks to nature and humans that could be posed through the widespread application of genetic engineering and CRISPR technologies. So what is it that, if we want to save, have a good futures for future generations, what does that mean? What is a generation of a human? What does human mean? And if being human is under some threat because of all these things that we could do to ourselves, then we need to address those issues much sooner than later. Why should we care about future generations? Here are four arguments or perspectives to answer this question. First, I believe that caring for future generations should be a deeply held value, that caring for future generations is good and just and virtuous. It takes a certain amount of courage, I believe, to think about people other than ourselves in many generations in the future. I think caring for future generations is also quite consistent with this journey as an archetype that can be found in the writings of Joseph Campbell, for example. And it's a journey of self-actualization, I think. It's a journey to be the best that we can be. I believe the journey has a rational component to it. So if you go back to the work of Rawls and his ideas of original position and under the veil of ignorance and how he came up with his principles for a just society, if you were to imagine such a situation and say, should we care about future generations? I think people would say yes. And they'd say, well, and every generation needs to have the opportunity to exist. And so so we would really want, from a rational perspective, try to ensure that journey continues generation after generation. And the last point of view is, I think we have an obligation to all life on Earth. And part of that obligation is to ensure that life on Earth is able to exist beyond Earth and move to other places in other solar systems. Then it could be that humanity is the best bet for life on Earth. Because if we went extinct, there's no guarantee that another intelligent life form that could be spacefaring would evolve in time to avoid the oblivion of the sun. So I think there are certain obligations that we have. If we care about future generations, then we have obligations to meet. And I'm using the word perpetual obligations. That these obligations will be there for all time. It's not that we can decide or not decide to meet obligations of future generations. These are perpetual duty, let's say. And these perpetual obligations are aspirational goals for humanity that, if met, will increase the probability that humans' high-quality journey to the distant future will be ensured. You can imagine that these obligations need to be stated at a very high level, that in some sense even sit over sustainable development goals, which I'll show in just a second. The obligations, as stated, must be very slow to change. They can change over time, certainly. Can be debated and so on as we learn more over time. But if they change too quickly, then plans and programs and policies to meet them would have to change quickly as well. And that change, as we see like in American politics and American environmental policy, You take a few years to do something and then something changes completely. And so you never achieve anything. So I believe that these obligations need to be slow to change. The set of obligations need to encompass essential aspects of ethics, morality, and human concerns. And so they're quite a wide range of types of obligations. And it would be advisable that these obligations are measurable, either directly or at least subjectively, so that one can develop a scorecard to see how well we're doing. So here are the 12 obligations that I propose in my book. We should work to prevent human extinction and prevent the extinction of Earth life. We should work to bequeath sustainable societies to our future generations. So that's sound political systems that don't rely on violence and ethnic cleansing and wars to exist, but change is more peaceful. We need to bequeath sustainable production with respect to energy and water and soils and so on. We need to reduce deaths from environmental risks, from air pollution and water pollution, for example. We need to preserve the essence of nature and the essence of humanity. And I would say that I don't really can say exactly what those mean. Those are open topics for discussion. But I think that they can be captured in this list of perpetual obligations. We need to maintain options for future generations. So meeting all of our perpetual obligations doesn't mean that there's no change, and that you can't change culturally or can't change politically. And I think that's not correct. It would be good to allow each generation its options to evolve and emerge and so on. And the better we do it with these other obligations, the more freedom we can have for future generations. We need to preserve human knowledge. I can't believe it's the case that we won't have any challenges as we move along with respect to societies and maintaining stable societies. And if that's the case, then at least we should try to preserve human knowledge so that when things get better, we will have that knowledge base to fall back on. We need to generate new knowledge to support the journey. I think a lot of the research that we do is not really focused on that. It's focused on other things. Minimize regrets with respect to unfinished business. This is an idea that Wendell Bell, a really eminent futurist, proposed, that there's some shared challenges or some shared projects that humanity needs to take on so that we don't have regrets that we have unfinished business. And lastly, fully inform current generations, our futures and obligations, and that's kind of where the futures literacy component comes in. So this slide shows that one can imagine perpetual obligations at this very high level. So if we're looking at climate change and transportation policy, for example, with respect to perpetual obligations, very good and sound transportation policies and sustainable transportation policies could essentially help us meet these four perpetual obligations: preventing human extinction, for example, and preventing extinction of all life on Earth. Sustainable transportation systems probably also support sustainable production systems and so on. And then international agreements and UN Sustainable Development Goals are consistent with meeting these perpetual obligations. And then national transportation policies and plans and regional transportation policies and plans and local land use transportation policies and plans all should be consistent with each other and move up the chain to help meet perpetual obligations. If you do all that, then you can reduce in a very systemic way greenhouse gas emissions, reduce impacts on ecosystems, and reduce air pollution risk, for example. So here is my scorecard of how we're meeting or not meeting the 12 perpetual obligations. I think that if in the American education system, the grades go from A to F. F is the worst grade. And so I think we get the worst grade with respect to preventing human extinction. I think we're not really seriously addressing that. And the probability of human extinction exceeds an ethical threshold, which I would argue would be around 10 to the minus 20. I think we're not doing a very good job with our bequeathing sustainable production or reducing environmental risks or protecting the essence of nature and humans. Moving down the list, I think that we can really do a better job of devoting research dollars, R&D dollars, to improving our long-term survival as a species. I don't think we have a shared human project. I think as far as minimizing regrets, I don't think there's one shared project humanity's working on. And I think we need, I know that Riel and his colleagues have been really working hard to improve futures literacy, but there's billions and billions of other people that need a futures literacy education. So I think we need a lot of effort there. So if we find that we're not meeting our perpetual obligations, then we have obligations to take action, and I conceive of these actions as levels of effort that humanity would take on. So if people would agree that we're not making much progress, or we're failing in meeting our obligations, preventing human extinction, for example, and extinction of life on Earth, then one can argue that we might need a Manhattan Project level of effort to deal with these meeting these obligations. And so going back to World War II, the United States implemented this Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb, and that took several percent of GDP to do that. If we're meeting our obligations, and then maybe we only need major programs to help deal with things. And if we're really meeting our obligations, maybe we only need policy nudges that don't even take a fraction of a percentage of GDP to meet those obligations. So it's just a way of framing, of taking the process through to what actions we might need to take at a global level. And if we do need actions, or if we have difficulty trying to judge what actions we might need to take, propose the establishment of national anticipatory institutions in NAIs. And the NAIs would have responsibility for judging whether current generations are meeting perpetual obligations. And to increase the gravitas of these NAIs, I recommend that they be formally established through amendments to national constitutions. I've read through over 100 national constitutions, and I think there are at least 5 ways that one can approach to amending constitutions. One is, in a lot of recent constitutions, actually, there are already provisions for human rights councils and commissions. One can imagine amending a provision in the Constitution for a human rights council to include being advocates for future generations. The same could be done with provisions related to ombudspersons, which are also in a fair number of more recent constitutions. A smaller number of constitutions have some proviso that allow legislators to represent aspects of society that they aren't elected to. So they could be, they represent the university sector, or they represent some other sector of society. And maybe legislators could also be appointed to represent future generations in those contexts. A fair number of constitutions call out very high-level, high-profile individuals or positions or organizations. For example, the House of Lords in the United Kingdom could be given the responsibility for being advocates for future generations. And lastly, if these 4 aspects are not present in a current constitution, one might need to consider creating a new institution. And this was the case I found with the US Constitution. There was no, there's no Human Rights Commission or ombudsperson or provision for new legislators or anything like that. So I developed a proposal to amend the US Constitution to create the Court of Generations. And this paper was published in the early 90s, and I consider this paper the seed for this entire book. It's taken me several decades to write this book, to get all the ideas together. But section 1 of this proposed amendment reads, "The power to judge threats to the security of the blessings of liberty to our posterity shall be vested in the Court of Generations, which shall be an adjunct of the judicial department of the national government." So this text is based on the text that is found in the preamble of the US Constitution. So I decided to use that text to make that link. Section number 2, the court shall consist of a grand jury and the members of the Supreme Court. The grand jury shall return a bill of indictment to the members of the Supreme Court if evidence suggests an intolerable threat to the security of the blessings of liberty to our posterity. The members of the Supreme Court shall decide whether we and our ancestors are in contempt of entirely threatening the security of the blessings of liberty to our posterity. So in the US system, like many court systems, the court can't take on a case unless something comes to the court. So giving the responsibility to a grand jury to consider this indictment is a way of bringing the case to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court cases in the United States are highly visible. And so any discussion of whether we are or not meeting our obligations for future generations would be quite visible to the US population. And so that would be the mechanism for moving society along to meeting its obligations. I imagine the court would meet every 5 years or so, and every state would may appoint a person to sit on the grand jury. So this proposal is very tied to my beliefs of how American society works. And of course, other proposals, other people in other countries would develop based on how they believe their system works and their societies work. So the NAIs would be paired with international institutions. So for example, we could imagine a world court of generations, and this world court would use judgments from NAIs around the world to judge where the humanities is meeting its perpetual obligations. There'd be an international panel on perpetual obligations, and this panel would synthesize humanities' knowledge about how well we are meeting perpetual obligations. This would be modeled after the IPCC, their international panel on intergovernmental panel on climate change, which does that with respect to climate issues. If we need to take some actions, then there should be a protocol, I guess, some kind of agreement amongst countries to take action. Then again, thinking that maybe there will be some tough periods through time, provisions might be put in place to establish perpetual obligations, do things that we wouldn't want to have just disappear because of political strife over time. So for example, one can imagine something called the Stewardship Institution, which would have the responsibility for overseeing the nuclear waste repositories around the world. So we would not want to have that knowledge disappear. If we're sending probes out into space to find new homes, we can have a group called Farsighters that would always be in place to track those probes, so we wouldn't lose that knowledge. All of these institutions would work together. The intergenerational panel on perpetual obligations would feed information to the NAIs and to the World Court. The NAIs would make their judgments and feed information and directives and advice to national governments. And the national governments would get together to make provisions related to the protocol. And the system is obviously anticipatory with a lot of feedback and learning over time. One can imagine actually a formal decision support system that would be developed, global anticipation and decision support system to support this entire process. So decision makers of any level of government or within non-governmental organizations or even private sector organizations be encompassed within this decision support system. They would propose their own plans, what they would do to help meet these obligations. Everybody would be able to see what those plans are and see how their plans are consistent or inconsistent with what other people are proposing, and the system would help the entire system move along to arrive at plans and processes and programs that are consistent with each other and meet obligations. So I want to emphasize that there's change is favorable, change is good, but within bounds. So you want to keep the large system, and so that everybody can live into the future and have the journey into the future, and have cultural freedoms and economic freedoms and so on and so forth, but within these bounds. So change is implicit within the system I just presented. So if NAIs are meeting every 5 years to determine whether we're meeting our obligations to future generations, that means that change is happening. Are we now meeting our obligations? Are we not now meeting our obligations? So change is happening. perpetual obligation number 8, maintaining options, is explicitly recognizes the value of socio-cultural evolution and change. And options for change are maximized when other perpetual obligations are being met. One challenge is how to tolerate political change without endangering our ability to meet perpetual obligations. Futures literacy is so important to this entire endeavor. We need to help people improve their understanding of foresight methods and outputs. We need to help them reduce their anxieties around futures thinking. I think there's, if there are changes needed in people's values, then adaptive work processes are needed to help people get through value change in ways that are positive and can help them be more anticipatory and better care for future generations. And we need this literacy would help people be more proactive about the big picture outline here and understanding the systems aspects of change within bounds. And all of the future literacy activities need to work to link community level foresight and decolonization of futures. So in summary, I can imagine this big picture of humanity's journey through time and space, and this big picture has many pieces. The big picture includes understanding why we should care about future generations and what our accompanying perpetual obligations are, and what kinds of institutional innovations we should consider to help us ensure our journey through time and space. Each of the pieces that I have presented need to be part of this big picture, but each piece itself could be improved. Each piece could deserve additional attention and discussion and research. But as these pieces are discussed and changed, just keep in mind how these pieces fit back into the big picture. And lastly, I do believe that we will need to pass through a singularity, a socio-cultural economic singularity, maybe around the year 3000, maybe earlier than that, if we're going to be able to continue our journey into the future. So that is my presentation, and I will stop sharing my screen and ask the panelists for their initial observations and comments. Irianna, would you like, Roumiana, want to go first?
No, I was going to suggest that Irianna goes first, if she would like to.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. That was very, very interesting and inspiring. Please allow me first to start by briefly refer to our work with the UN HLCP Foresight Network that UNESCO has been appointed as a coordinator for almost 3 years now. So in this Foresight Network, the network has members from more than 30 UN entities across the UN system. And this network is a supporting mechanism to the UN HLCP, High-Level Committee on Programs. And in this role, we have been asked lately to contribute to the thematic work related to our duties to the future, including aspects of intergenerational equity and fairness, as well as to new public goods and others. So Bruce's work and presentation is very timely and very informative and helpful to our work. What I was thinking, listening to the presentation and reading Bruce's work, is that somehow the omnipresent complexity and emergence of our world to some extent call us to go beyond preemptive approaches and perhaps beyond our present assumptions about how the future or the future generations will be or should be. In other words, it calls us not only to imagine and engage with future in terms of preparation and planning, but also to use the futures for sense-making, relating, improvising, and appreciating the present in order to pursue novelty, embrace complexity, as Riel has many times mentioned. We know that our images about the future, our assumptions, ideas, conceptions, emotions, exert great influence on what we see and what we do in the present. They open up or narrow possibilities for action. And in relation to agency and transformation, we do believe or we do know that future framing is essential. So I was wondering again, if we continue to focus more on preparation and planning and preemptive action, or perhaps in search of continuity, how can we be sure that we do not reproduce and perpetuate, like structural problems by retrieving, projecting, and extrapolating past and present ideas, assumptions, and conceptions to the future, colonizing, like in some extent, the future with today's ideas. And my greatest concern relates to the perpetual obligation number 8, as Bruce said, like maintaining options. In short, I guess I've been wondering, how can we make sure that we are not colonizing the future for the generation to come by imposing our views of today or present visions of the future as a target to be achieved, and to some extent, like limit or impeding future generations from using it. And perhaps, like, what if we perceive the future as a resource, as a common public good that cannot be depleted through use, and whose use by someone does not affect its use by other people? And I'm looking also forward, like to hearing Roumiana's views and all these, like Bruce's and Riel's and everyone else. So, thank you.
Thank you, Irianna, and thank you, Bruce. Would you like to respond to Irianna first, or would you like to hear both of us speak and then respond? What do you prefer, Bruce?
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And I just have to say that immersing myself in your book was really a pleasure and an intellectual pleasure and challenge. And when I take it the way I always do when I begin to learn something, is to take it in its own terms, and then step back and take a more reflective view. So taking it on its own terms, I really appreciated your work and the enormity and the intellectual courage of taking on this future study approach. And but then stepping back a little bit, and I will echo some of Irianna's thoughts, maybe frame it slightly differently. From my perspective and where I'm coming from, just to say, because I think that it's important for us to situate ourselves in embodied and embedded ways. My point of view is a little bit, perhaps to some extent, similar to Gloria Anzalduya's, of a mestiza type of subjectivity that I can relate to Western thinking, but also I carry my Eastern European kind of thinking. And I'm sure that many people in the audience also have either this dual or complex subjectivities, or completely coming from different angles. So I think there's a perspectival approach to this. And to say that, I'm beginning with the term humanity, because the term humanism and humanity is fraught with difficulties, fraught with colonialism, fraught with imperialism, and fraught with dichotomies of all sorts, kind of the dichotomous thinking of self, other, nature, culture, man, woman. Even here, I'll just parenthetically say, when we talk about future generations are many, if not most, will be of woman born, to quote Irigaray. So just taking a feminist point of view and a little bit more of a continental post-structuralist point of view here, I'm thinking that kind of the Western-centric episteme, whether it's a hero's journey, which is also a Western concept. There are many journeys, but the hero's journey is particularly Western. Claiming that it's universal is also difficult. Also, the individual is part of that epistemic understanding, because in many cultures, the individual is more of a individual rather than an individual, and can enter relationships and experiences that self as a very relational self. So compared to a relational ontology and ontology of a process ontology, I think there may be some objections to the way the whole institutionalization of perpetual obligations to future generations is framed. So that's on the humanist side, because you speak about post-humanism, but you speak about post-humanism in the book mostly in the context of transhumanism. But there is a critical post-humanism that is becoming quite dominant in the humanities today, that says many of the sexualized and racialized and naturalized others have never been human. They've been excluded from that project entirely. So they no longer really want to come on that train, not because they're refusing, not because they're anti-humanist, but because they feel that a post-humanism of a different sort, of a critical post-humanism, is more the project that they would like to be on. And in that sense, kind of the shared human project, especially when we use metrics from A to F from the US educational system, or we think of them as some Manhattan project effort, already does epistemic violence, because the framings carry, a lot of those fraught problems with them. And that's from the humanist point of view. And there's also an anthropocentric, I think, bias, because I know that I've been reading through the text. You state your values very explicitly, and they're very liberal and humanist and progressive values. But I think there's a kind of that reflexivity, which perhaps might be helpful, is to see that anthropocentrism is not just about domination, but it's also about paternalization. So when we think that we are the stewards of the planet and we're the stewards of there's still a hierarchy there, that we are the saviors of nature, of other species. I know we've done a lot of ecological devastation on this planet, but going the other way doesn't mean that we're still not thinking supremacist, anthropocentric supremacy. And finally, the institutionalization that you speak about, which is one approach, and I think it's a needed approach, perhaps. But my worries here are similar to Irianna's, somewhere around the number 8, perpetual obligation to future generations in terms of options. Options is already it's a financialized term. And this whole turning of uncertainty into risk creates the possibility for preemptive action. But uncertainty also has another side to it, which is about openness and novelty and emergence and hope for people who are not included in the project of humanity or humanism. That uncertainty or indeterminacy is also hopeful. So turning all of that into risk creates additional, because you can hedge against risk and it can become financialized as well. So there's the institutionalization in terms of future change, which you acknowledge that change will happen almost on every level. I think it's dangerous to institutionalize before preemptively, while change is expected, and especially, as you say, you're a believer in the singularity. So who will we become becomes important, and what will bodies be able to do in the future? In a Spinoza sense, no one can say, right? And institutionalizing that within our current systems, I think creates a framework which may, rather than enable change, may foreclose change. Again, I'm saying where I'm coming from. I'm coming from a totalitarian country. I worry about totalizing approaches, a totalitarian country in the past. And finally, I think I have another word or two on using language. When we think about colonizing the universe at whatever stage in our life, future, and thinking about the options as well, as I said, as financial, using financial language, and the whole managerialist kind of thinking that we can manage change is one way of thinking about change, but there are other ways, and they're usually connected with other ontologies and other epistemologies, or entirely unethical onto epistemology, which thinks of itself in different ways. So if we think of ourselves as relations being prior than relata, that's a very different spin. If we think about today taking care of relations that create future people to come, we wouldn't know who they may be. So I'll end here. I'll just end with a quote from Walter Mignolo. I think it's from On Decoloniality, I believe, from that book. He says, "The illusion that Western civilization could create the problem and solve it is facing its limits." Thank you.
Wonderful. Back to you, Bruce.
Well, I'm just pondering what she said. If other people want to chip in, I'd be happy to hear from other people.
Some hands raised, or?
I would say my first thing is this: I can see why you have some issues with some of the language. Certainly, some of the language I used was not intended as you have taken the language, for sure. Maintaining options is from the future generations literature, and it certainly wasn't, back in the 80s and 90s, interpreted as from a financial view at all. So I'm not even sure what kind of word one would use if one wasn't using the word options. I guess I am concerned that that without some kind of structure, that the probability of, and again, I do think in terms of probability, the probability of humanity being able to ensure its journey for the future becomes very low. And some of the comments you made kind of chip away at even the idea of having that kind of structure. That it's not even possible because of for this and this and this. And you're also saying that even imagining that there is a structure is just some kind of Western idea. Maybe it is, and maybe I'm so stuck in Western thinking that I can't imagine. I can't imagine us having a high probability of living into the future without some kind of structure, some kind of anticipatory framework to help us anticipate what might happen and try to reduce the probability of bad things happening. So anyway, those are my reactions to what you had to say. And I'd be certainly would be love to hear other people, their reactions, and if they have questions for any of us, that'd be great.
Right. Thanks, Bruce. So I'll take that as an invitation to chip in myself, and appreciate very much the richness of the discussion. I mean, and as Irianna was pointing out, this is something that all the UN agencies in their collective wisdom are trying to grapple with, and it's something that's come to the attention of, I think, the public in a broader form, either through popular culture, which certainly gives us plenty of apocalyptic images to think about and to worry about. But if I could just reformulate it a little bit, did you consider at all that the best way to develop options would be to not develop options? In other words, that in fact, I mean, there's a scenario, and so it's speculative, right? Just it's an imaginary story, that by being defensive or preemptive, you actually create rigidities and preempt certain adaptations and reactions that in fact would be profoundly important. And the underlying theory behind that is a really super simple one, which is don't put all your eggs in one basket. In other words, the basket you've described is a very familiar one, and it has the structure, like you said, and it is true that it's difficult to imagine from the kind of 1,000 years of building, the more than a couple of thousand years that humanity has been building pyramids and monuments and walls and weapons and destroying the world around us. We've been taking this path for a long time in our relatively short history, right? But it could be that's actually what makes us vulnerable, because it's a kind of all the eggs in one basket, the basket of our supremacy and our ability to control. And I just wanted to add in one other element into that question, which is, if I think I can't die or shouldn't die, or if I think nobody will allow me to be foolish and run the danger of dying, I mean, it doesn't have to go as far as suicide, but being, a little carefree and wanton and silly. But, with the reality that I'm mortal. If somebody said, no, you got to be immortal. You must be immortal. You must never die. Would I be myself? Would I be the kind of human that I want to be, that I appreciate that I am? So those two elements here seem to me to, in fact, to a certain extent, the safety that you and the immortality that you talk about, that's in the form of extinction already. So those are kind of two questions that come to my mind. You want to throw the floor open to other folks? Sure. Just put your hand up, people, and identify yourself, please. Just say briefly who you are and where you're sitting. Johnny O'Rourke, I see your hand up.
Hi guys, thanks. Thanks for all your comments. So I'm at the moment just working on my own research project using scenarios and in the context of carbon budgets and accounting and so forth. And this tension of extracting from the future rather than, having obligations toward the future is something that I'm really grappling with at the moment, because many of the structural elements of accounting and finance at the moment are very much geared toward extracting from the future. And I'm really beginning to try and think about the ways in which future scenarios function that can be either ethical or deeply unethical. And there's something for me that I haven't quite yet reconciled in my mind as whether or not futures, this way of thinking about the future I haven't figured out yet. Is it striking the balance, or is it at risk of becoming extractionary more than it is actually obligatory? And I'm taking a very much a phenomenological approach to these questions around ethics. And this theme of hope, and what happens when we create these very vivid visions of the future that induce a lot of hope within us. But to pick up on Roumania's point, which is, at what point does hope become deeply unethical and justifies our ability at the moment? I see it with carbon budgets specifically, where we are currently not acting today because we have managed to justify extracting from the future based on the hope of technological advancements. And these are not very long-term technological advancements. These are, the idea that in less than a decade, we'll have technology such that we don't have to worry so much about the transition. So for me, the key question is to Bruce or to Riel or to anybody, I guess, what should I be thinking about to really maintain this ethical provocation in the context of what futures literacy is expected to do for us?
Thanks a lot. Appreciate that. Let me know when, Roumiana, I think you wanted to dive in. Please put up your hand if you'd like to get a crack at it.
I did, but not in response. But now I wasn't thinking about Johnny's comment. I was just wanted to say something from Bruce's book. A great example, I think. I think that the oldest institution that you mentioned here is the Bushmen of Kalahari, which is kind of their curing ceremony trance dance, which is 40,000 years old. And I think that was the oldest one that is mentioned in the book. And I was just wondering about that as a kind of as a scenario. What was their thinking to be able to maintain it for that long? Was it an institutionalized thinking, or was it something else? So I think it's a good example of exploring those different ways of thinking about the future, which fall fairly easily into the transforming, about the futures literacy framework, about whether it's emergence and collective futuring, which is a very important point. I think this collective futuring rather than individual expert-based. So I think that great example is probably a different way of working with the future so that they could keep that institution for 40,000 years, a particular, probably under UNESCO auspices, the UNESCO non-material heritage.
Well, it's true that I mean, I think that the things that have lasted the longest were not intended to be long-term. Which is an interesting paradox and might be a lesson. I want to pick up, there's a question from David Sefton in the chat about the SDGs and the effectiveness of the SDGs. And I mean, I think it's an interesting issue, Bruce. Could the SDGs be seen, as kind of a harbinger or a kind of, let's say, I mean, and for that matter, the UN in general, coming out of the Second World War, et cetera, as something that points towards, in a sense, the continuity of the institutional framing that you're giving this. And I mean, the nation state, the constitutions that you reference, the constitutions are part of that movement to national ways of looking at the world and the multilateral and the global and the notion of ministries and laws. All of these are essentially extrapolations of existing systems. The fact that the SDGs may or may not be functioning, I mean, for that matter, the Paris Agreement, et cetera, we can't seem to get our act together on carbon. I guess it kind of provokes a question about, can we get there from here? Meaning, is this the point of departure that will actually generate the kind of resilience I think you're looking for? So I don't know if you've been provoked enough, Bruce, to jump in.
I can maybe deal with that question. Yeah, so I think SDGs are important, but they're stated fairly short term, right? You know, we want to achieve this by 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And I think that in this larger scheme, having these shorter term goals that relates to larger term obligations is important. You just can't solve. It's good to try to simplify the problem into various steps. And to talk about, to respond to Johnny, I would say that if we are, with respect to carbon budgets and so on and energy, if we are extracting from the future to such a degree that we are essentially violating, our obligation for sustainable production systems, then that's an issue. But if we're not, if what we're doing is not necessarily leading to not meeting our obligations, then maybe that's just part of what our society is deciding to do. Part of our options, our economic options, or what we've decided, what technology we want to use. But if it has this longer term impact, then I think things become more serious. From this perspective of this discussion. So responding to a couple of Riel's comments, all our eggs in one basket, I think that, if actions are needed to do this or that, those actions don't always have to be in the same basket. They could be a whole range of different actions. I don't quite see the link between immortality of you, particular, or a person, and trying to maintain the journey of our species. I think those are somewhat different. But I do appreciate your point that, maybe, I'm assuming that it's a good thing that we don't go extinct, but maybe doing a better job of addressing that question is important. Anyway, so those are some initial reactions. It takes me a while to think through things in these kind of.
Thanks. Other thoughts from other folks? Raise a hand. Simone.
Hi, hello. Thank you again, Bruce, for this always inspiring sharing of your thoughts. There were some questions now also in the chat about what could we do as a specific type of organization. And I think the key here is the we in the sentence, because I think something that I, again, have learned today is that we have to concentrate much more on looking for ways to collaborate and to discuss and to share views and perspectives, also regarding the question about ethical way of thinking about the future. So is there something like an ethical guideline or so? I think this is partly solved when you start discussing this with other people and with people with diverse backgrounds, with other ideas, with other needs. And then you realize that your own perspective is just one perspective. And when you discuss in a larger group about possible actions, you will come up with something which should fit for all of the people involved. So my learning and my message again is do much more participatory actions when you want to do something for the next generation. Thank you.
Thanks, Simone. Other people want to jump in? I can kind of, so to pick up on the I have a slight worry that you know, another kind of extrapolation is that and Bruce, to go back to your point about, you know, the immortality, I hear you that it's, you know, there's a difference between the collective and the individual, but it's more the mindset, as it were, which is that when you think about the world around you from the point of view of trying to preempt and preserve, and when you try to put things in dire by the standard of extinction, in other words, if you say extinction is anathema, extinction is inconceivable, extinction is to be avoided at all costs, and you think about options, well, we're back to the 20th century. Hey, communism, fascism, the end justifies the means. I'm just trying to get there. This is the thing that has to be done. And I am pretty worried personally, just to bring it to that level, that the current context, and it could be geoengineering, you know, but I mean, it could be other things, that bring us to a point where we go back. Well, it's not ever gone, but we fall into that trap of making the case that the ministry of know-all for the future and its options, which is communism, I mean fascism, I mean capitalism, that option is the option that will save us, and therefore, you know, a lot of things can go by the wayside, including our folly. So, you know, there's been plenty of scenarios that we've seen in films and whatnot that, you know, you're going to be denied your SUVs because it's killing the species. You know, that goes beyond masks, huh? People are pretty upset about being asked to wear masks. Now let's take away their SUVs because it's bad for the planet. But you see the dilemma here. And I just wonder, you know, when you were thinking about the kind of ministry of the future, the Kim Stanley Robinson type thing that I think you were kicking it around maybe before that was, you know, on the science fiction agenda. But, you know, how do you kind of feel about that side of things?
Well, so one thing I tried to do is to imagine if there is an ethical threshold for human extinction. And so in the U.S. environmental policy, I think, and this is in other places of the world, there's this ad hoc risk level of 10 to the minus 6. So if an individual is being subjected to an involuntary risk that is greater than 10 to the minus 6, then environment regulation is required. Then if we're going to take that notion and say, well, what would be the less risk level for humanity? It would be much more strict. Okay, and so I came up with this 10 to the minus 20 as the threshold. But if you're not near that threshold, you don't have to do anything or much. Okay, so and it's very hard to kill everybody off. So I don't think we're very, very near that threshold. But if we're near that threshold, or, you know, 10 to the minus 6 or 10 to the minus 5, or, you know, if that threshold is, you know, we really can, everybody agrees that there's a 50% chance we're going to go extinct in the next 100 years because we can see it. We can see all of those futures. Then yeah, we take people's, then you do what you need to do to survive, you know. And if people don't want to do that, then I guess then we don't deserve to survive. And so from the risk management literature, there's always this opposition to setting risk levels at 0 because you can never get there. And so an open question is, what is that ethical risk threshold? Is it 10 to the minus 20? Is it 10 to the minus 10 or whatever it is? That's an open question because it costs too much and it's virtually impossible, especially with respect to human extinction and all the things we face, to get to that level. So that's how I think about it. Kind of judge where we are, judge what the effort would be to respond to that at this present time, and do the best we can to try to survive. And if we're not near that level, we don't have to impose things. And the reaction doesn't necessarily have to be tied to any one political system. And actually in my book, I do try to talk about the need for political experimentation, that we only learn from trying new things. And it seems as though if we've already decided that this one form of government is the best and we don't try any other ones, and I'm not saying we need to try ones that have already been tried, but there must be some new ideas out there. You know, how can we find the avenues for experimenting with new forms of government and allowing the centuries to pass to do the evaluation? I mean, if we're going to be around for another million or so years, maybe we do have time to do that, but it seems like, given our own psychologies, we want to know all the answers right now. We don't have the patience to implement these longer term learning processes.
Well, I think, thank you. You framed the issue well. There's a lot more to explore here. One of the things that strikes me is that we know that risk requires certain assumptions, and we know that risk is estimated on the basis of models, and we know that there's lots of different models which are going to determine whether the risk is -6, -20, and it depends a lot on your model and also your variables and your data, all of which are pretty incomplete, we know, but even if they were perfect, they don't include uncertainty, because we know that risk and uncertainty are two different categories. Uncertainty is the unknowable. And since evolution, which you just kind of made reference to, is contingent on uncertainty, you know, how do we begin to bring that into the equation? In other words, you know, and I guess this goes back to what I think Irianna was trying to touch on in terms of being able to cultivate this openness. And it was also kind of what I was trying to say about experimentation. You know, and it's an old debate from the 19th century called reform versus revolution. And that debate was one about, you know, endogenous change and incremental change and improvement. And the other debate was about, you know, you can't do that because you have to leave behind the vestiges of the encumbering oppression. And there's no way to escape it. You can't have a benevolent king or a czar, and you need to chop their head off and transform from top to bottom. Well, we have some traces of what that achieves, that point of view about revolution, which to me reinforces the point about taking a risk approach, which is that as a closed system projection, the revolutionary perspective, which means I know how to make a revolution. Here's how you do it, which is precisely the opposite of an uncertainty and evolutionary approach, which would say, I can't ever know what that would be, because the things that make it possible, whatever that happens to be, haven't yet happened. And so liberating the future from my risk perspective is actually essential for the many baskets. So you see, I think perhaps I wasn't very clear about the many baskets, but what I meant by many baskets was can we get outside the basket of risk, which to me is a determinist, controlling, preemptive, calculated perspective on evolutionary survival. It seems to me that most of the lessons of evolutionary processes point to the role of the unknowable and the uncertain that emerged out of nowhere. And novelty plays an absolutely fundamental and central role. How do we enable that novelty to be part of this resilience story?
Well, so also in my book, I propose using a slightly different frame to represent uncertainty. So I introduced this notion of imprecise probabilities. So which actually, looking at the work of Glenn Schaefer and others and historical thinking about probabilities, probabilities weren't necessarily thought to be additive at the very beginning. They were non-additive probabilities. And so the idea is that if you're thinking about human extinction, for example, you'd have an upper probability and a lower probability. And the difference between the upper and lower probability represents your ignorance about the problem. And that ignorance will always be there, okay? And even ignorance about, as you say, evolution over time of technologies and humanity and so on, increases that distance between the upper and lower probability. But looking at all the evidence that you have with respect to human extinction, including evolution, people might still be able to agree what those upper and lower probabilities would be. Then the issue is, given those upper and lower probabilities, what are the ethical responses given what we know and given what we don't know? So if you find that the upper and lower probabilities, and everybody agrees, are way beyond the threshold that you're comfortable with, then you're going to do something, even if there's large uncertainties still. But if they're all above that threshold, then yeah, so then maybe you want to do something, and maybe you can't at that point worry about the other things you're talking about. But if there's this large distance and the upper probabilities are just a little bit above that threshold and lower probabilities are way below, then maybe you take a different approach. So I think that's one way to be able to capture these uncertainties you're talking about. And another is to help establish what those probabilities are. I propose having a very large set of potential scenarios, extinction scenarios, on the order of thousands. And everybody around the world can contribute to that. And you can contribute scenarios where you imagine that there are some unknowables and there's this evolution and so on. And indeed, oh, well, that's great. And those scenarios dominate the future, and they're all within the acceptable thresholds of human extinction. And if that's the case, then we don't have to worry about things. But if you keep coming up with these scenarios and more than one out of every 10 to the 20 are leading to extinction, and you've got thousands of these scenarios, then maybe you're making the case that something does need to be done. So those are some of the ways that I would propose to deal with some of the things you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. And I think that there is the question, the boundaries between closed and open are not hard cut, and the relationship between the unknowable and ignorance is not always, is a moving boundary. But I would make a distinction between ignorance, which, at least the way I would think about it, is that it's something that is potentially discoverable, but I don't know, so I'm ignorant of the facts. And uncertainty, which is unknowable, and no matter, even if I was small g, God, and I knew everything, I still wouldn't know this, because I wouldn't be able to imagine TikTok, Churka, whenever. And so the difficulty still remains, that in some senses, in dealing with certainties and uncertainties, is that it's trite to say it, but the only certainty is uncertainty. and perhaps, and thinking back to what Roumiana was saying about other epistemic perspectives, the notion that we're just part of a big evolutionary flow, and that our continuity is kind of outside that, doesn't fit, is something that seems to me also worth entertaining. And that questions the very notion of what extinction is. And I'm a bit skeptical, actually, about the concept of extinction altogether. Because even, let's say, a meteorite hits the planet, and our genetic material gets ejected out into space, a billion years from now, it might land on another planet, and that genetic material might play a role in who knows what. I mean, in an evolutionary creative universe, what does extinction mean? That might be slightly too cosmic for most people, but I don't think it's when we're using the timescales that you're using, it doesn't seem to me to be completely outside the realm of our thinking when you're thinking in those timescales. Roumiana?
Yes, just to probably to add to this is that again, going back to different ways of knowing, to supplement, well, we're not saying that these kinds of structures and thinking are not, to some extent, perhaps necessary frameworks, but also complementing that with maybe a more creative, artistic approach even. I mean, there's so much, for instance, arts-based research is just for that, is to explore novelty, to explore, especially non-qualitative arts-based research, is to look at process and see how new things emerge without having kind of a concept of, but this is what the outcome, this is the outcome I'm aiming for. It's just a complementary, different way of knowing that we enlarge or we extend ourselves. It's the extended self thinking that we can use complementary, different ways of knowing, creative, artistic, spiritual, intuitive, together with rational approaches and presentational knowing and propositional knowing and different kinds of knowing. That was my basically what I, and also indigenous knowing. So in a sense, rather than us framing something, perhaps talking to people who have been through singularities, because we can find many people on this planet who have been through singularities, not once or twice, many times, and they have developed ways of knowing that we can learn from. So going back to what Simone said, more participatory approaches, but that doesn't just mean collective, but inquiring and listening to others with different experiences.
Thanks, Roumiana. Other voices? Somebody want to chip in? I can keep going. I think that the Roumiana, the issue you raised that's related to genocide, if I can take it to that place, that was an extinction of, I mean, again, so now here I'm going to use the term that's somewhat in vogue, and that I'll make reference to bioaccomodation. If I can queer the idea of extinction a little bit, extinction's a regular happening. It depends a bit on your point of view, and I understand the current hominid in its form of running around in this form of organization, etc., extinction. But again, the continuity discontinuity perspective on this does seem rather coming from one point of view, and I understand it and quite well. I think it's the current dominant and powerful point of view. But I wonder, in the context, for instance, of the UN work that's being done on intergenerational equity, and Johnny made reference to this, and it's in the book, Bruce. The question of what do we owe future generations, and how do we justify what we do now on the basis of future generations, locks us in to the unawareness, the insensitivity to what we're doing now. And it's interesting. Again, will make another popular cultural reference to Star Trek and the primary directive to not interfere. And one aspect of that was do not interfere because it's a form of genocide, which was clearly more sensitive at that time than it seems to be at the moment. But again, Bruce, I just wonder, even from the point of view of the futurist community, what do you think the prospects are for us to take this more plural perspective on the issues you're raising? I mean, you've written the book and it's out there. Are you getting reactions and input from the futurist community that are trying to, like I said, queer the notion of extinction, or inquire more openly about what we mean by birth and death, beginning and ending?
Actually, I had hardly any feedback whatsoever. on the book. So this is great to start to get some feedback.
Well, that's a plan. I mean, I think you're in the thick of a debate that's going on now globally at a more active level, and certainly one of the things we're going to do is connect this up to the United Nations discussions around temporal intergenerational. But I think it's also obviously central to the climate change, climate extinction, and even the coining, in recent popular political discourse of the extinction meme is of relevance here, because it sets the stakes, as it were. But I really appreciate the fact that you've pushed, and as Roumiana said, in a courageous and like you said, kind of years worth of work to frame these issues and to provide us with some scaffolding for the discussion. I mean, there's work going on in other places as well on existential risk. Have you had a chance to kind of interact with that crowd at all, or not?
A little bit with Simon Beard, and a little bit through Ted Fuller's interactions with that group. A little bit with Seth Baum, yeah. And his work, yeah. But this, in the field of futures, or looking at the socially and professional futurists, this work that I'm talking about is so different from what they do, and it's because they're just focused on organizational futures or whatever, and a shorter time frame, which is fine. But some of those folks have trouble grasping these larger issues as well. So I'm finding.
Well, great. Any last comments, Irianna, Roumiana? Well, listen, I really want to thank you all for participating in this. I'm really glad that we've recorded it. I know that there's quite a bit of demand out there for a discussion around these issues, and I find most of the discussion, by the way, much less elaborate and developed. Many things are just kind of taken for granted in the context of saying, oh well, we just need to do this, and in the futures field, we know a little bit about self-fulfilling prophecies and how scenarios become templates for people's behavior and expectations. These days, the geoengineering trope is running rampant. Might be a little bit exaggerated, but is certainly present in lots of different places. So hopefully this session and its recording and the ongoing Transforming the Future webinars will be a forum for us to explore and continue to test the boundaries of our ideas. So I deeply appreciate your contribution here, and those of everybody who attended, and the two discussants, Roumiana, Irianna, thank you so much. As always, you're wonderful. And for you, Bruce, have a good rest of the day. For those of us in Europe, it's the evening, and for those out in Asia, go to bed. Anyhow.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you, everybody.